Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to McHugh House. Welcome to Studio M. I'm Robert Michael Fisher, and this is my partner Barbara Bickel. And we're the two artists that started Studio M in this space in downtown Calgary in Beltline. My intention today is to do a brief introduction to 4 areas, calling them the Big Four. And why they're Big Four is they're 4 areas in my life as both an artist, as a thinker, as a writer, as a researcher. And 4 areas, the areas that I would say are all about something that I'm very passionate about. They're all a little bit different. And obviously I'm an artist in one way, and I'm a researcher in another way, and a writer in another way. But when they come all together, really what brings them together is the word. So that's going to tell you a lot about me, and I'm going to give you a little bit of bio background about why this word became so important in my life and still is to this day. But before I start that, I'm going to start with the manifesto that Barbara and I created for Studio M. Manifesto really is a nice sort of assortment of ideas and creative passions that artists or others, philosophers, will sometimes put into a small publication that represents what they'd like to move out into the world. Manifesto for Studio M. We are committed to an inclusive and expansive curatorial practice that stems from the Latin root curare, to take care. Everything is an encounter with others, human and more than human, a tableau of unique creative collaborations. We commit to a matrixial co-poetic paradigm and of art workings in radical trust. We practice a co-relational aesthetic as foundational and preceding the ethical, while both integrating the political and the aesthetic. We live with the premise that everything began without fear. Imagine that. That'll be a topic that's going to be quite heavy today in the Big Four. Fear. We are committed to living, creating, and teaching within a gifting and healing economy, alternative to the way things are now. And the last one is spontaneity. It's the lifeblood of play, humor, sociality, sustainability, health, and ecological sanity. Okay, well that's certainly a manifesto that gives a sense of who I am, who Barbara is, and how we, as we come together, how we are, and what we sort of imagine that Studio M would act as a nucleus or hub for creating people who might connect with some of those ideas, some of those values, some of those beliefs, so a worldview really. But again, as I say, underneath what I am teaching today is this about these 4 big parts that are influenced my life, that are a major part of what I teach. And because I'm here at McHugh House in Studio M in Calgary, I'm going to be teaching these 4 aspects, these 4 domains. And I invite you to possibly explore one that you're attracted to or more. Where to begin, I'll start with a little biography, because coming to a concept like liberation is not exactly what everybody goes around, as you may notice, talking about liberation. No, we don't. We usually talk about how to cope with reality, how to get on with the world and make the best of it, and all these other kinds of phrases that come, and don't complain, and or just do it, as Nike would say in their ads, just do it. So, well, I don't quite work that way. I'm a critical thinker, and so the first part of my bio, I think, that makes me a critical thinker is, I think of when I was 12 years old. I come from a family of 5, mom and dad, and older brother, younger sister, and I'm the only one that kind of pursued secondary education, post-secondary education, and continued to be really an intellectual type of person. And none of my other family were interested in those kinds of things. They were interested in getting a house, 2 cars, kids. As I came to think about my criticality and where it started, there's so many places, but I think a real big one I remember at 12 years old. So this is just prepubescent, right, where we make big decisions about our life as a person as we go into teenagehood and then getting ready for so-called adulthood. And I remember at 12 years old saying to myself, I was in bed, I think I was very upset. Some fight was probably going on in the house between mom and dad or something like that. I don't remember exactly. And I said to myself, you know, whatever I do in life, I just don't want to be like my mom and my dad. That's a pretty amazing thing to say for 12 years old. I don't know where that came from, but I remember it to this day. I remember, and I'm 66 years old now, and I remember how passionately I felt about it. It was like, talk about a life commitment statement to oneself. Talk about the beginning of a manifesto for myself before I even knew what that word meant. So what was I rebelling? What was I critical about? Obviously I was rebelling. I said as I look back, it was, I do not want to be only a working class person. And my parents, I would say, were in the poor to working class, worked hard, double jobs, still couldn't afford to really buy many things very fancy at all, and we only bought a house much later in life. They were always renters, etc., etc. Lived in, lower class neighborhoods and all those kinds of things. I don't feel bad about that. I feel it was a very great learning place for me. And all I knew is by 12 I said I don't want to be like them, stuck in what I saw was the same kind of thinking as most everybody who conforms in the working class on what is valuable, what isn't valuable. And the fact is that they suffered with all kinds of their own addictions and alcoholism, past traumas, that they never really healed, they never really transformed, and they died that way as far as I'm concerned in a very narrow kind of world. So really I think what I was saying is I want a bigger world, I want a world that's liberating, not one that just hangs in there, right? Kind of clawing your way through life to stick and kind of make ends meet and think, oh well, that's it, that's life. So I'm very much interested in the human potential because of that. Obviously I have gone to post-secondary school, done many degrees. I'm not going to go through all my big bio. I have a copy of it here if you're interested. I can send it to you. But eventually, 12 years of post-secondary education in environmental sciences, ecology, and then into education itself. Anything that I could try to figure out how to liberate us from the kind of crises that I started to see as I grew up and an adolescent, the crises that are facing our world in the future. I grew up in the 60s, 70s, so we were into liberation, there had to be a big transformation. So again, my parents sort of just represented the kind of society that to me wasn't changing in the society in many ways that caused a lot of the problems that I as a young person would have to face in the future. I think young people feel that today. So first of the big four I'm going to just talk about is, because I started doing art very early in life, the arts, that became a really important way. I was a musician and rock star, blah blah blah, I wanted to be, and played in garage bands and all that sort of thing. And that was a whole domain of knowing and reality. So I'm going to label this first part of the big four. This is nearly number one. There's no real order to these big four of what I teach, but it gives you an idea. After that, I finished high school, went to technical school at NAIT in Edmonton, Alberta, and I had a mission. I was not good in school. I was horrible in school. I was probably a very typical working class kid who had no motivation to learn, no motivation to go to post-secondary. And I also had some learning problems. I couldn't read well, and I couldn't understand and comprehend well, so it was a very major inhibition to my growing in the school systems. I also didn't like the discipline. I didn't like the way they terrified people and intimidated people. I was completely rebellious to that very early. So I went into the sciences as another domain of knowing, and knowledge and way of being, a whole world, and I love those worlds that were so different. So arts was sort of my ground foundation. That was certainly connected to nature because I was a real nature nut, became a birder and still am. And then that into a career in the sciences. Probably knew that the arts was not going to be a career making money, but I just wasn't committed in that way. I was very turned on by scientific knowledge and the domain of thinking and methodologies. And then eventually I became interested in psychology and ethics and what I'll call the sphere of morality or morals. Probably just call it morals, arts, sciences, morals. So those three domains, why I'm kind of putting them in this Venn diagram, is to show that they all have a uniqueness of way of knowing big reality, capital R, big reality. They're all a way to tap into and a way to evolve, really, and a way to express those three different domains of reality. And there's other philosophers, Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, the great German philosopher, Ken Wilber, and others. And this is who I started getting into as I started looking at, I'm interested in that kind of knowledge, that kind of knowledge, and that kind of knowledge. I want it to also knowledge to have a purpose, right? An ethical meaning purpose. And that's where liberation starts to come in. Well, this whole domain of thinking and captivating knowledge from all different domains is really my number one big four, and that is a little bit of a complicated term, I'll explain. Critical integral theory. And integral theory is a term that's out there. You can look it up on Google, for example. There's a lot of stuff on integral philosophy, integral theory. And I started getting into reading about that before it was really called that, and before I actually even recognized what I was calling it, and the work of Ken Wilber, American philosopher, now labels himself an integral philosopher, contemporary. But there's many more. There's many integral theorists and people who are developing integral models of knowing, integral models of knowledge. Why? Because they're trying to capture as much reality as they can. And why were they doing that? Why did they want the most reality? Why did they want this holistic, integral, right? Like integrated knowledge. You can see the integration of all these domains. They wanted it because they felt that was the problem with humanity. That's why we weren't in a liberated state. Why we're creating immense crises in our world is because we weren't taking in all the domains of knowing. We were sometimes focusing only on one, and sometimes it was religion, right, where morals is all about, and that's sort of the pre-modern time. Or we just only focus on the arts, trying to find all the ways to understand reality and live, and or the scientific, which is so popular now and has been for the last 300 to 400 years. Well, the integralist says, and again I teach a whole course on this, I could teach a whole semester on this if I wanted. The integral model says, look at them all, these different perspectives on ways of knowing, and these are sort of the big three sometimes called, that one is not better than the other. That's the basic foundation of this theory. It says one is not better than the other. They're all equally important in that way. And they're all different, and they all have overlaps of patterns of connections. And if we were to structure our knowledge and our education systems and curriculum and life upon these different ways of knowing and keeping them in this integrated balance, great. We'd be on a good track. We'd be on a great, a great path. And I like to use this word in the middle, and Ken Wilber does too. We'd be on a path of wisdom and compassion. We would really have a good chance to get those down, because it's in the core of that way, those ways of knowing, those diverse ways of knowing. All right, so that's the critical aspect. It's critical of how we know reality. It's critical that any one of those should get preference. And when it does, the integralist says, oh, no, that's going to be very incomplete knowledge if you only take a lot of that and not much of this or any one of those privilege. Alright, so that was kind of my first of the big four I wanted to introduce you to. I'll just leave those on for a moment. And of course, you can see right now we're talking kind of in universals. So when I move to the second form of knowledge and knowing that I teach about, I'm calling the Indigenous-Western Encounter. I have a book over here I'm going to show you. I just finished. Let's see, it's not here now. There it is. So the Indigenous-Western Encounter really is the coming together with indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing that have been on this planet for 99% of the living history of the Earth. And the 1%, right, beyond that is really Western colonial white person's worldviews, approaches, and other groups. But we call those kind of the more modernist, and quote, civilized, which is a very dangerous word, is the 1% of human history. Again, I'm talking about history right back to the evolution of our species. So today we have the Truth and Reconciliation movement. We have the revival movements of the indigenous people, which have been around for quite a long time, even during the civil rights movements. They're less well known. And the indigenous peoples around the world are saying to us, Westerners, I'm just going to talk about for now, because I see myself as a Westerner. And I was writing here about a person who is both a Westerner and he's adopted an indigenous perspective because of his own mixed blood heritage. His name's Don Jacobs. This encounter is a really powerful one. And you'll notice in here there's nothing that shows in this integral theory approach, even though I love what it offers, there's nothing in there that shows the difference between an indigenous perspective and a non-indigenous perspective, or what I'm going to call Western. Four Arrows, in his work, calls it the dominant worldview. So he sets up this indigenous worldview versus dominant worldview. Invisible in here. And this is the danger of these kinds of models, and these kind of models are often criticized by especially indigenous scholars and peoples, and certainly by post-colonial theorists and thinkers, as too much a Western view of knowledge and reality, and misses this really important difference that 99% of our history as a living species of learning how to adapt to the planet, 1% Western dominant worldview has been around. The argument is well, that might be nice to have those integrated, but you know what? They still have made a mess of the planet. There's still a big mess going on. And the indigenous people says, because you're not paying attention to the ways of knowing, the worldview and the values, and our understanding as people of the old ways, of the earth ways, of the Great Mother's ways, of nature's ways. You're not paying attention enough to that. Your science isn't going to do it. Your art is not going to do it. Your morals are not going to do it. Well, of course, indigenous people also have arts, sciences, and morals. So how did I work with that problem? Is when I started studying the indigenous work, probably a few decades ago, but more recently to certainly do this book for the last 10 years, I really focused on Fearol's work. And I basically said, well, I think what we need to put in here is we need to put in the very core is indigenous worldview. So I put that in the middle of the integral big three kind of model, And that, to me, would help us correct and always keep at the core the 99% great wisdom and compassion that humanity, through Indigenous peoples and their relationship to the environment, which is so intimate, it would keep these from flying off and getting too arrogant. It would keep bringing them back to their center. And in some ways, again, I like notion it brings back to Mother Earth. Right? So there's a tendency with these kinds of knowledges to become very masculinized as they move out and want to expand and territorialize the world, which is great because there's great adventures and great expansions that can happen through those modes of expanding out. But the return part of the knowledge is, hey, and also return back to the source, back to the core. The Indigenous worldview. And the reason is just empirically, as far as 99% of our history is Indigenous. And it's really the messes that came after agriculture and industrialization to modernization, post-modernization and so on, the information age, which digital, etc., we're in now, have caused a lot of ruin. And so Fearology in his book says, we really got to question the notion of progress. And that's really what post-colonial thinking, this kind of critical worldview. And so when I say I bring in a critical and integral view, that's one of the ways I bring in the word critical, through the Indigenous perspective. As best I can learn it as a secular white person, coming from that worldview. Okay, any questions or thoughts about that? All right, I'm just going to not erase this in any total way, but just erase it for convenience. Because there's another way it's the third way in what I teach, and will continue to teach in Calgary and the world, as people are interested in it. I'm going to put something else in the center here which I think is very powerful and very important to, again, creating that wisdom and compassion in an integrated and in an Indigenous-Western awareness of the problems of these two worldviews. Again, not one is all good, one is all bad. They both have their good and their bad, but one definitely has privilege, the Indigenous, because of its long proven history of adaptation to nature. So this third one I'm going to bring in, I'm going to use the term I teach, something called Fearology. Whoa. And so Fearology is, obviously as it sounds, you can hear the focus is I'm very interested in, as you saw in our manifesto, right? Manifesto says, it's possible the world actually started without fear, and of course fear has quickly come into the world, and unfortunately is quite dominating today. And I think any of you, if you think of your experience right now, if you think of the experience of people you know, of governments, of all kinds of powers in the world and how they operate, there's a good sense, I think, we can just commonly say that they're very fear-based. They're not very love-based. And of course that gets into a very powerful critique of how come we've gotten into such a fear-based world from a love-based world of possibility. So that's been part of my work, and I've actually recently developed a fairly good outline for what a discipline would look like, called Fearology, just like psychology or neurobiology, terrorology, emotionology. There's all these different ologies that are now coming into the world. Psychology, sociology being the more traditional ones, and many others. And I actually believe that we need today a discipline of study on fear itself from a new lens. And I want to talk about, well, what is that new lens, that we can put, where we can really symbolically look at and see fear from a whole new perspective, because we're using a new lens. So I'm therefore not, you can see I'm critical of, well, why don't I just study the psychology of fear and teach about that and what neurobiology is showing and teaching about fear, or other fields, philosophy, whatever, religions, they have something to say about fear. Oh yeah, they all do. I've studied this for 30 years, since 1989. However, what they don't bring, any of those fields, they bring their own lens, right? The psychologist will bring the lens of psychology, which is a lot influenced by science as privileged. Religion will bring mostly the ethical and moral and theological. They kind of miss this stuff and other perspectives. So I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in a critical, integral, holistic, liberational model of understanding fear. So I'm using fearology as a way to construct a new methodology to deconstruct the old ones and recreate new ones. A reconstructionist approach. And that's probably one of my greatest passions as an intellectual and as a teacher. And I bring that lens now, watch, here we go, bring that right into this center again. Again, we're keeping the Indigenous versus the Western encounter in there, in that center of these knowledge domains, ways of knowing. And I bring in this lens, and this lens is called many things. I'm not always using one word for things, if you read any of my writing and publishing, but ultimately it's the lens of fearlessness. Just let you have a glance at that for a moment. Kind of makes sense though, doesn't it? To develop a lens that studies fear itself as the topic. Not just fears, right? Like fear of spiders, fear of heights, fear of self-esteem, loss of self-esteem. I'm not so interested in fears. I'm interested in fear itself, the patterns of fear, or fear patterning. And how fear actually has developed what I call fear, with these marks on it, that is actually fear without a feeling. It's actually not an emotion. I'm not saying it isn't connected to an emotion, but it itself is not an emotion, as we normally understand emotions as developed through philosophy, theology, and psychology, which are developed mostly through the Western dominant worldview. Fearlessness, which Four Arrows is very interested in as an Indigenous thinker and critic himself, and an eco-philosopher himself, and an Indigenous educator, very exciting, is that we both really connected on this notion of fearlessness as a perspective or lens to bring to the study of fear, and put into real practices of how fearlessness would help us move beyond these fear patternings that are both regular fears that we understand, right, that I mentioned earlier, and fear without a feeling. Fear as an actual patterning, and actually he talks about fear as the foundation of hypnotic processes. Yeah, I know. Moves right quite quickly into hypnotic and hypnosis. He's a hypnotherapist himself. He also says Indigenous people understood trance and hypnotic experiences always as part of living, as part of how they explore and experience the world. And that's not like an unconscious trance or a possession trance or hypnotic state. It's a light hypnotic state of concentration. So that's where he gets going, and I connected with his work because he was really interested in fear and how it moves to fearlessness, or how fear moves to worse toxic kind of fears. These kind of toxic fear that is fear without a feeling. And you could even say psychic numbing and trauma through high trauma is another kind of way of experiencing or identifying what I might label this fear with these marks. It's a very complex process that involves psychology, biology, sociology, history, politics, the Indigenous-Western Encounter. It involves the dissociation and separation that came when the morals hated the sciences, sciences hated the morals. Pick up of fearlessness, and that raises the question, so, am I trying to get rid of all the fear in the world by fearlessness? Well, yeah, it'd probably be an interesting world. I don't think that's going to happen, and there's good arguments to be made from myself or others even that fear is part of life. It has a role to play, and I like to see fear and love as these two major forces as part of how we understand human motivation. So I'm just showing you this one little art piece I played with here. I created this a few years ago because I was thinking about this relationship between love and fear. A lot of the religions teach that love is greater than fear. A lot of the New Age philosophies, like the Course in Miracles, teaches love is greater than fear, and so love is greater than fear. That's one choice. That's one belief. That's one hypothesis. And then I also say, but there is another hypothesis, sort of dialectically, perhaps opposed, but perhaps just part of the process, where fear is actually greater than love. Or what if they're both true? And that's where it gets interesting. So as an investigator, as a thinker, as a philosopher, and as an artist, you can see I'm just interested to play with images and ideas so that we don't just start dropping in, as so many people do, love is greater than fear, and love will save the world, and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. All of those kinds of logics that follow from that. And I always say, well, hold on a minute, maybe it's not quite so straightforward. And in fact, those two formulas aren't even enough. And I've even pushed this diagram in an article I'd written recently in a journal on education to include the word fearlessness, to even make it more complex. So love, fearlessness in between, and then to fear. Fear to fearlessness to love, love to fearlessness to fear. So I'm playing with models and theories, and again, Four Arrows is quite interested in these. And hopefully, if you come to my book talk, I think tonight, about 7 p.m., I'll be talking about the writing of this book. I'll be reading some bits from this book, which is an intellectual biography of Four Arrows. Just before I move on to my fourth of the big four, I want to say that Four Arrows and I have played with this, just talking about, is the Western encounter with the Indigenous, the encounter between a love-based reality, the Indigenous perspective, and a fear-based reality, the dominant and Western worldview. That's a very challenging statement because it starts to ask the question, me as a Westerner, you as perhaps Westerners, if you identify so, is that sort of everything we've learned about reality in the Western worldview, the dominating worldview, especially since modernity, 300 to 400 years ago, is everything in that worldview primarily, not totally, but primarily fear-based. Is that why we're in such a mess we are today? And that really, what I say, is a toxic fear that has accumulated due to woundedness that's not being healed. And that brings me to my fourth. So number 4 of these big 4, and I'll finish off, is something I call liberation peer counseling. This was a term that Barbara and I created quite a few years ago in the early 90s. LPC for short. I'll probably use that when I talk about this. So this notion of a fear-based reality, and how does that get shaped and formed and reproduced? A love-based reality, and how does that get shaped and formed and reproduced? And then how do they encounter each other, right? That becomes this really interesting ecology of dynamics. I'm very interested in that. So I want to explore that probably for the rest of my life, because I'm not happy with how we understand love and fear and their relationship. including fearlessness. Liberation peer counseling is something that came from reevaluation co-counseling, RC. Harvey Jackson was the founder of this back in the 50s. And because I'm only going to give you such a short overview today, I'm not going to give you details of. You can look up reevaluation co-counseling if you want. There's also international co-counseling, which was a split, a branch off that line. I learned RC first, and many years of practicing it, then teaching it. But when I started teaching it, I said, I want to include some of these other things I'm interested in. And arts was a really important component I wanted to bring in. I wanted to bring in more an understanding of an organic sense of community and how that can build around liberation. So how do you build a learning, living, liberational community? Big part of what I'm interested in. Barbara was interested in joining me on this project in the early 90s. So liberation peer counseling is a peer-to-peer, just as it says, it's one-to-one. This is the fundamental unit of doing an actual practice that would bring about, theoretically, a liberation of all beings who practice this practice. And the reason being is the argument of the theory fundamentally is, and you'll see it's going to echo what I've just been saying, is that we are a coping culture. We meaning, you can extend that as large as you want to, but I'm just going to, because I'm a Westerner, I say the Western worldview, and I'm not going to include indigenous peoples of the old ways. Not including them in my generalization for a lot of the reasons I've just talked about. But the people who follow the Western worldview, and that can be indigenous ethnic groups and peoples, completely westernized in so many ways. Any of us in that worldview, following that worldview, are arguably in a coping culture. That's what LPC theory says. And the alternative, which would be like our indigenous natural primal state and ways of being in the world, is a healing culture. So coping versus healing, how do they relate? I'm very interested in that. So go back to my parents for a moment. My parents learned how to cope. And I was born from a coping family. And my mother was highly traumatized as a Belgian person, living as a teenager in post-World War II and during the last part of World War II. So it was a very traumatized nation of Europe. The Nazis invaded Belgium for 3.5 years or so. This greatly influenced my mother. Of course, she developed the best coping tools she could. And unfortunately, alcohol became one of those tools. Avoiding pain is another part of the coping complex, right? Where pain just becomes like a bad thing. Fear that comes from pain is a bad thing. We try to avoid it rather than learn from it, integrate it, and learn how pain and fear are natural processes of hurting, moving toward healing. So the basic premise of peer counseling, as I teach this and teach people these skills so that they can practice it with each other to liberate each other, is to listen to these symptoms. Listen to that pain instead of immediately, I'm going to cope with that, I'm going to grab some high carbs to eat, I'm going to go get my painkillers or run down to the drugstore or to the doctors. Now, sometimes that might be a useful thing to do, but if you get into a pattern, it becomes an addiction itself to avoid the pain, the hurt, that is calling to be healed. Well, why is it calling to be healed? Because it's natural to do so. Our whole organism, living systems work on when they're hurt or damaged, they repair themselves, they recover, and they move even to growth and development in exciting, creative new ways sometimes. Okay, so that's that basic distinction. And the main part of the course has so many parts of it when I teach peer counseling, And I'm right now planning to teach it in one of the communities in Dover, in Calgary. The main part is to recover our natural healing processes. And there's, I think 8 or 9 sort of natural healers that can be identified, and were identified in RC theory, and we keep those as foundational in pure counseling theory. We've added a few of our own, which one is an arts-based spontaneous creation making, and you'll notice that was in our manifesto. The use of spontaneous play, creative processes. We believe, Barbara and I and others could support this, I think, in the literature of how important that is to create when we feel destroying is going on. You go to the opposite. So that's one, spontaneous creation making. Crying, laughing, sweating, yawning, shaking and trembling, talking spontaneously when you're hurt, and getting attention. So as I end this part of my Big Four, I'm attempting to bring an awareness as a teacher, and many other people are doing this, I'm not the only one, attempting to bring a better attention and quality of attention to all human beings, so that when we think better, we're more brilliant, we use our defense systems, our recovery systems, our healing systems more attentively, and we have better attention for others, especially when others are hurting. And that, to me, is where we're falling very short. We're losing the ability to attend to hurting others, and we get judgmental. We want to shut off and go numb, not listen, judge them, and all kinds of things. So again, I won't go into all those dynamics of the course, just to say it's a chance to recover your healing processes, to recover your zestfulness, your inherent human nature, your human potential, the holistic self rather than a fragmented self, and I guess some people would say a happy self and a joyful self, as I prefer. Okay, well, that pretty much ends the intro to these Big Four. Just repeat them. Critical integral theory is a way of organizing knowledge in a holistic way. An Indigenous-Western Encounter, which is paying attention to our primal history, the 99% of our life, and understanding that worldview compared to a Western worldview, and that ultimately we have to figure out to do two-eyed seeing. We have to think both through an Indigenous perspective and the lens of a Western perspective, if you're a Westerner, and how to bring those together in an integrated way, a corrective way. And then the whole discipline of fearology, which is so important to understand fear in a better way, in this relationship of fear to fearlessness to love, and this great dynamic I'm talking about, this ecology of deep motivations. And then the fourth one is we need a real practice of kind of every day, how do I get attention on my distress, my hurts, and how do I give that in return equally to a peer? So it's always an equal exchange. And those are structured ways of bringing about liberation. And all of them, I hope, will start to inspire you to actually believe, to actually imagine, perhaps to have faith. Again, whatever those words you connect with, that liberation actually is possible. Thanks a lot.